Hi all, let's have a look at the final game of the World Championship. So Topalov was playing white against Anand black, and we're going to take Anand's perspective. I know this reduces the tension for who won. You can probably guess who won if I'm taking black's perspective, and I've already said the match has ended, so that's another clue that it was the decisive game, because otherwise there would have been a tie break. So anyway, Topalov kicked off with d4, and Anand d4 played d5. So solid stuff, classical. After c4 though, we have a change, thankfully, from the Slav defence. Now in the Slav defence, black is keeping that queen's bishop, active, to come out later, in the game, like f5 or g4. But with e6, this bishop is going to be, usually a problem to unravel later and develop. And sometimes, the bishop does develop to b7 if black plays b6 later. So this diagonal becomes important later for that bishop. Now, I'm emphasising this because the queen's bishop is really, a major issue to solve for black in these kind of opening systems. Okay, so after knight f3, knight f6. Both sides developing a knight, controlling the centre a bit more. Knight c3, putting more pressure on d5. Not minding d takes c4, but Anand, he doesn't play d takes c4, he plays bishop e7. So a little bit less materialistic, more solid, simply developing the bishop to prepare to castle maybe next move. But in fact now, after bishop g5, not the immediate castling move, but this move h6, so provoking an exchange on f6, but does white really want to give up the dark square bishop? That's actually a playable variation in its own right anyway, because white would continue with things like e3, rook c1, and try and maybe get pressure on the queen side later. Maybe even the classic minority attack would be a good plan. If black has a rigid pawn structure, say like this, then later, white often tries to dent that pawn structure with the classic minority attack. But so these are typical plans of Queen's Gambit declined positions. So h6 also has an advantage though, that usually later white has a battery against h7, so it would actually be winning a tempo anyway if black has to play h6. So black gets it over and done with now. So asking that bishop, do you want to take on f6 or do you just want to play bishop h4? So bishop h4 was actually chosen by Topalov. And now Anand simply castled. So far, it doesn't look like an ambitious system for black. It's not really an aggressive setup in the same way like the King's Indian would be, or even the Nimzo Indian. There's hardly a trace of what Jeremy Silverman would call imbalances in the position here. Black's just playing very classically, but he's got a concrete problem to solve, this c8 bishop. So after e3, what he does do now first is a freeing maneuver, and it's called actually the Lasker defence. So that's named after Emanuel Lasker, the second world champion, who was known for his kind of philosophical approach to the struggle of the game, where Lasker would often play positions to over provoke opponents in apparently their favourite sort of territory, and Lasker had this amazingly dramatic win, even in his old age against Capablanca, playing in like this exchange variation of the Royal Pairs, which many chess enthusiasts will always fondly remember. So Lasker, the philosopher, seems in a way appropriate to sort of be using a weapon of the second official world champion against Topalov. So knight e4. So what does this move knight e4 do? Well, it's encouraging the exchange of these dark square bishops, and at the same time it doesn't mind the temporary double pawns here. And you might think, these double pawns, they might be a big deal. Why not knight takes e4? So that's a question that you might have. Let me answer that question actually. In the game though, bishop takes e7 was played. So we have that kind of simplification which maybe helps black focused then on solving his problem queen's bishop, to help how to develop that. But let's have a look. If white tried for a bit more with knight takes e4 based on the double pawns, it doesn't really work that well, because for example bishop e7 here, because if the knight moves then bishop h4, so bishop e7, and let's say knight here to d2. In this kind of variation, black can play f5. Now if white tries to sort of undermine that first pawn to at least get pressure and maybe clamp down on e5, so say white plays a move like f3, in this last variation black can just simply play e5 and get a very nice position now, for example d5, and just temporarily just sacrifice that pawn if needed. So this is very nice compensation, and all of a sudden black has solved the queenside bishop problem and also has got a semi-open f-file to play with, and white will have difficulty even castling queenside. So this is a kind of variation which might favour black, and I was looking at ideas like this even from this opening where the rook g6 might be useful, rook a6 to g6. So black has a very active position if white tried to double the pawns here with knight takes at e4. Okay, so let's go back to the game. In the game, Topalov decides bishop takes e7 will be the path he wants. After queen takes e7, again he's got another opportunity to play knight takes e4, but again it seems to be enough for black just to play f5 with the possibility of e5, for example f3 and now e5. For example, de, queen takes e5, queen b3. Black's fine because again the queenside bishop problem is solved. Black has active pieces, for example knight c6 and maybe even rook b8 and bishop e6 later. So Topalov again, he doesn't want to play knight takes e4. He just plays this move, rook c1, supporting the knight on c3, because he doesn't want to have double pawns himself to have to recapture with b takes c3, and he wants to keep the queen flexible maybe as well to go to c2. So here actually black still is provoking white to play now after c6 the move knight takes e4, but again even in this example case now it's okay for e5 here. e5 guarantees black a good game, for example d5 f5. So maybe this last variation it's not as passive as it looks if black's got moves like f5 and e5 to liberate after accepting temporarily these double pawns. So this is an interesting idea, this idea knight e4. So rook c1, c6, and bishop e2 was played now. Not really provoking yet knight takes c3, but nevertheless knight c3 is now played. So rook takes c3, and white would seem to have potential pressure along the c file, or the classic minority attack if c takes d, e takes, and later this fixed pawn structure could be attacked later with due preparation, b5, b takes c6, the classic minority attack. So after rook takes c3, d takes c4 was played, so seemingly freeing black's game a little bit more, being able to use for example the d5 square, but also potentially that diagonal is going to be useful for this bishop. So he's providing an open road for the bishop now. After bishop takes c4, knight d7, the knight may come to b6, or it may help for c5, and more unusually it might actually go to f6. I say that because I've been checking some of the exponents games, Artur Yusupov, who plays the Lasker defense a lot, and in 22 games at Chess.Games.com he's only won 3 times with it. On the other hand, he's only lost about 4 times, and 3 of those were against Anatoly Karpov. And usually when he plays it, he usually plays an a5 later in this line. So after castles, b6. So he's trying to solve the queen's bishop problem. bishop d3. This has all been played before, and there's a couple of Yusupov games I think from this position, but different opponents now. Well, instead of bishop d3, I think Karpov in one game has played bishop b3, keeping the bishop on that diagonal, and someone else has also played exactly what Topalov has played, bishop d3 and then bishop e4 here, so temporarily exploiting that slight weakness of the diagonal. Anand simply moves his rook to b8, so he's not too concerned yet. Queen c2, and now here is where Yusupov, I believe, has played a5 a couple of times.